I lost my job, my reputation, and my sense of safety over a crime I didn't commit. They walked me out like a criminal, and everyone I trusted believed the lie. What none of them knew was that the real culprit was sitting close enough to watch me fall. And when the truth finally came out, it changed every life it touched, including mine. I used to believe that if you showed up on time, did your work with honesty, and treated people with respect, the world would meet you halfway. I believed that truth had weight, that character mattered. I was wrong. Or maybe I was just late to learn how fragile a good name really is. My name is Daniel, and for 12 years I worked at Halstead & Rowe Logistics, a mid-sized company that prided itself on family values, a phrase printed in bold letters on a plaque near the front desk. I helped build that place from a cramped warehouse with flickering lights into a polished operation with glass offices and catered quarterly meetings. I trained new hires, fixed problems no one wanted to touch, and stayed late when deadlines pressed. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, I was dependable. That used to be enough. On the morning everything collapsed, I arrived early, like always. The parking lot was still half empty, the sky gray with that quiet promise of rain. I remember noticing the way my reflection looked in the car window, tired eyes, a tie slightly crooked, and thinking I'd straighten it later. I never got the chance. When I walked through the front doors, the receptionist avoided my eyes. That should have been my first warning. Instead, I smiled and said good morning, because that's who I was. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, my supervisor, Karen, was waiting. She didn't smile back. She asked me to step into conference room B. Her voice was clipped, professional, like she was reading from a script she didn't write. Inside the room sat 2 people from HR and a man I recognized from corporate compliance. The blinds were half closed, casting thin stripes of light across the table. They asked me to sit. No one offered water. No one asked how my weekend was. Karen folded her hands and said, "Daniel, we need to discuss a serious matter." My stomach tightened. I asked what was going on. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails, transaction logs, and a summary sheet with my name typed at the top. According to them, I had authorized a series of fraudulent refunds to a shell account over the last 3 months. The total was just over $87,000. I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed wrong in that room. I said there had to be a mistake. I didn't have the authority to approve refunds without dual sign-off. I pointed that out. The compliance officer nodded and said the approvals came from my login credentials. My hands went cold. I told them my password was private, that I'd never shared it. HR said the log showed activity from my workstation during my scheduled hours. Karen avoided my eyes again. I asked to see the raw data. I asked to call IT. I asked for time. They told me the investigation was complete. The word terminated landed like a heavy object dropped from a height. For cause, effective immediately. They asked for my badge. They asked for my keys. They told me not to contact colleagues while the matter was under review. I tried to speak, but my voice came out thin. I said I'd been loyal. I said I had a mortgage and a daughter in middle school and a wife who'd just gone back to part-time work. The HR representative nodded sympathetically, the way people do when they've already decided. The compliance officer said if I cooperated, things might go easier. Cooperated with what? I wanted to ask. With a lie? Security walked me to my desk. My coworkers stared at their screens a little too hard. One of them, Marcus, looked up like he wanted to say something, then didn't. I packed my things into a cardboard box, a framed photo of my family, a mug that said quietly crushing it. I remember thinking the mug was mocking me. When I reached the elevator, I realized my hands were shaking so badly I had to set the box down to press the button. The ride down felt like falling. Outside, the rain had started, light but steady. I stood under the awning for a moment, the box dampening at the edges, and tried to breathe. I called my wife, Lena, and told her I was coming home early. I didn't tell her why yet. I didn't trust my voice. On the drive home, every red light felt like an accusation. I replayed the meeting in my head, searching for a crack, a place where logic could wedge itself back in. Someone had used my credentials. Someone had framed me. The thought was obvious and useless at the same time. When I told Lena, she went quiet. Not the angry quiet I feared, but the stunned kind. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked what we'd do. I said I didn't know. That night I barely slept. The ceiling fan ticked. The house creaked. My phone stayed silent. By morning, the rumor had spread. A former coworker texted me to ask if I was okay. Another asked if it was true. My brother-in-law, who worked in finance, warned me to get a lawyer. We didn't have lawyer money. We had savings meant for emergencies, but I didn't know how long this would last. The worst part wasn't the job. It was the way the world seemed to tilt. Friends stopped calling. A neighbor mentioned hearing something about work. I felt eyes on me at the grocery store, even though I knew that was in my head. Still, shame has a way of painting everything the same color. I filed for unemployment and was denied because I'd been terminated for misconduct. I applied to other jobs and got polite rejections. One recruiter hinted that my situation made employers nervous. I started waking up before dawn, heart racing, already exhausted by a day that hadn't begun. I thought about the people who had access to my workstation, about the afternoons I stepped away for meetings, about the trust I'd handed out without a second thought. There was one name that kept circling back like a moth to a porch light. Eric. He sat 2 desks over. He was charming, quick with a joke, always eager to help. He'd asked me once about the refund system, said he was curious. I brushed it off, showed him the basics, nothing sensitive, or so I thought. The idea that someone I worked alongside could do this felt worse than the accusation itself. Weeks passed. Bills piled up. Lena took on more hours. I sold my guitar. I swallowed my pride and asked my parents for help. Every day I told myself the truth would surface. Every day I wondered if it ever would. What I didn't know then was that the truth was already cracking under its own weight, waiting for the right moment to break. And when it did, it would force everyone, especially me, to reckon with what was taken and what could never be given back the same way again. The days after my termination blurred together in a way I still struggle to describe. Time moved, but it didn't progress. It just pressed down. I developed routines to keep myself from unraveling. Wake up early, make coffee, check job boards, apply, get rejected or hear nothing, repeat. Lena tried to keep our home normal for our daughter, Maya, but kids sense fractures the way animals sense storms. She started asking questions about money, about why I was home so much, about whether we were moving. Each question felt like another small failure I had to swallow. I called the company again, asked for a copy of the investigation report. HR told me everything had been documented internally and that my appeal window had passed. I asked about involving the police, because if money had been stolen, someone had committed a crime. The compliance officer said they'd already closed the matter. Their tone suggested I was a nuisance now, an inconvenience they'd already filed away. I hung up and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to understand how something so wrong could be handled so cleanly. What kept gnawing at me was the technical side. I knew the system. I'd helped implement it. Dual sign-off was required for refunds over $10,000, yet the summary sheet showed approvals neatly stacked under my credentials alone. That shouldn't have been possible, unless someone had elevated access or unless logs had been altered. I reached out to an old friend from IT, Sam, someone I'd mentored years ago. I was careful with my words, vague enough not to sound like I was fishing. He hesitated, then said he couldn't discuss internal systems, but before he hung up, he added quietly that sometimes logs didn't tell the whole story. That sentence lodged itself in my chest. Sometimes logs didn't tell the whole story. I started writing things down. Dates, times, who sat where, who had access when. I wasn't trying to play detective. I was trying to stay sane. Every note felt like a small anchor. Eric's name appeared more than once. He'd covered my desk days I'd been pulled into long meetings. He'd complained loudly about his debts, joked about how the company made more money than it knew what to do with. Jokes, I'd thought. Harmless venting. One afternoon, while picking Maya up from school, I ran into Marcus in the parking lot. He looked surprised to see me, then uncomfortable. We exchanged small talk that felt brittle. As he turned to leave, I asked if he believed I'd done it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't think you're stupid." It wasn't a full defense, but it was something. He glanced around and lowered his voice. He said things at work were tense, that the refunds had triggered an audit from a client who noticed discrepancies, that Eric had been unusually nervous lately. My heart started to pound. I asked Marcus why he was telling me this. He shrugged and said he didn't like how it all went down. That night, I told Lena everything, the suspicions, the patterns. She listened, eyes tired but focused. She said if I was right, the truth would come out eventually, but we couldn't hang our lives on eventually. We needed income. I took a temporary warehouse job on the night shift. It paid less than half of what I used to make, but it kept the lights on. The work was physical and mindless in a way that sometimes felt like mercy. Other nights it just made me angrier. I'd stack pallets and imagine Eric sitting at my old desk, laughing, untouched. Months passed. Winter settled in. The holidays were quieter than usual. We cut back on gifts, on decorations, on expectations. I told myself it was just a season, that stories like mine didn't end in silence. They ended in reckonings. I didn't know how or when, but I believed it, the way people believe in sunrise. The call came on a Tuesday morning, an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail. When I answered, the voice on the other end introduced herself as Detective Alvarez. My knees went weak. She said she was following up on a financial investigation involving Halstead and Rowe Logistics. She asked if I'd be willing to come in and answer some questions. I asked why now. She said new information had come to light. My hands started shaking again, but this time it felt different, like adrenaline instead of fear. At the station, she laid out what they'd found: a shell account traced to a prepaid phone, access logs that didn't align with badge scans, video footage from a secondary hallway camera that showed someone at my workstation late one evening when I was documented as off-site. The face in the footage was grainy, but the build was familiar. Eric. Detective Alvarez said they'd brought him in for questioning. He denied everything at first. Then, when confronted with bank records linked to his sister's address, he broke down. I didn't feel triumph when she said he confessed. I felt hollow. She told me he'd exploited an admin vulnerability, escalated his access, and masked the approvals to look like mine. He'd counted on the company wanting a quick resolution, on a scapegoat, on me. I asked what would happen next. She said charges were pending. She also said the company would be notified officially. I left the station and sat in my car for a long time, hands on the wheel, breathing. When I told Lena, she cried. Not loud, not messy, just quiet tears that seemed to release months of held breath. Maya hugged me and asked if everything was okay now. I said we were getting there. Inside, I wondered what okay even looked like anymore. The company called 2 days later. This time, Karen's voice trembled. She said there'd been a development. She said they were conducting a review. She said they were sorry for how things unfolded. I didn't accept the apology. Not yet. I asked about reinstatement, about correcting my record, about public acknowledgement. She said they'd be in touch. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Truth had surfaced, but it had taken months of damage with it. What I didn't know was that Eric's confession was only the beginning, because once a lie collapses, it pulls everything attached to it into the light, and some of those things would force the company and me to face choices that couldn't be undone. When the company's official email finally arrived, it was written in the careful language of liability and distance. It acknowledged that new findings had altered the outcome of a previous investigation. It stated that my termination had been based on incomplete information. It stopped short of saying they were wrong. I read it 3 times, my jaw tight, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. Months ago, I would have accepted any scrap of validation like oxygen. Now I wanted more than words shaped to protect them. They asked me to come in for a meeting. The same building, the same conference room. I wore the same suit I'd worn the day I was fired, cleaned and pressed, like a quiet act of defiance. Walking through those doors again felt unreal, like stepping into a place that existed in a different lifetime. Some faces looked away. Others looked at me with something like shame. Karen met me in the lobby. She apologized again, more personally this time, her voice soft. I listened without responding. In the room, the compliance officer was there, along with someone from legal I hadn't met before. They explained that Eric had confessed to acting alone, that the company had failed to follow certain protocols, that my record would be amended. They offered reinstatement to my former position, back pay for a portion of the time I'd been out, and a private apology letter. Private. The word landed hard. I asked if they would make a public correction, if they would inform clients and staff that I had been wrongly accused. The legal representative hesitated. He said they'd consider appropriate communication. I felt the months of silence, the sideways looks, the financial strain all rise up at once. I told them reinstatement wasn't enough, that they destroyed my reputation quietly and now wanted to fix it quietly. That wasn't justice. Karen's eyes filled with tears. The legal rep adjusted his glasses. They asked what I wanted. The question surprised me. I said I wanted a formal statement sent to all staff and clients involved, clearing my name. I wanted my termination reclassified as wrongful, and I wanted compensation that reflected not just lost wages, but damage done. They asked for time. I stood, thanked them for the meeting, and walked out before they could say anything else. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and laughed, a short, shaky sound. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd that standing up for myself felt like a risk after everything. Weeks passed again, but this time the waiting felt different, less like drowning, more like holding my breath before a dive. The warehouse job ended. I turned down another temp offer, betting on a resolution. Lena supported me even when fear flickered in her eyes. She said we'd survived the worst already. I believed her. The company agreed to my terms. A formal email went out. My name was cleared. Eric's actions were described without using my name as context. It wasn't perfect, but it was public. They offered a settlement, not enough to erase everything, but enough to acknowledge harm. I accepted. I declined reinstatement. Walking back into that building every day felt like reopening a wound I'd just learned how to close. Instead, I took time. Real time. I slept. I picked Maya up from school. I played my guitar again. Slowly, the tightness in my chest eased. I found a new job with a smaller firm that valued transparency because it had learned the hard way what secrecy cost. On my first day, my manager said, "We trust people here until they give us a reason not to." I felt a familiar ache, but also something like hope. Sometimes late at night, I think about Eric, about the choice he made and the wreckage it caused. I don't wish him harm, I wish him honesty sooner. I wish the company had chosen patience over convenience. Mostly, I wish I'd known then what I know now, that truth doesn't always rush to your defense, but it does arrive eventually, if you keep standing. The moral I carry with me is simple: earn the hard way. Your integrity is not proven by how loudly you're defended, but by how steadily you hold to the truth when no one else does. And when the truth finally speaks, make sure you're ready to speak with it, not just accept whatever apology is easiest to give. After the settlement papers were signed and the emails went out, I expected relief to wash over me like a tide. Instead, what came was something quieter and more complicated. It felt like standing in a house after a storm had passed, walls still damp, air heavy, every creak making you flinch. The crisis was over, but the echo of it lingered in ways I hadn't anticipated. People think justice is a switch you flip. In my experience, it's more like a dimmer, slow to brighten, uneven in its glow. At my new job, I kept my head down. I learned systems, memorized names, delivered work early. I didn't volunteer personal details. When coworkers asked why I'd left my previous company, I kept it vague. It wasn't a good fit, I'd say, and changed the subject. Part of me feared that if I told the full story, the shadow of suspicion would follow anyway. Once your name has been spoken alongside the word fraud, even briefly, it sticks to you in ways that apologies don't fully erase. At home, Lena noticed the changes before I did. She said I startled easily, that I double-checked locks, that I read emails twice before sending them. I brushed it off at first, told her I was just being careful. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd replay moments from the past year like a film stuck on a loop. The conference room, the cardboard box, the rain. I realized that being proven innocent didn't undo the feeling of being disposable. One evening, Marcus reached out. We hadn't spoken since that day in the school parking lot. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee. I hesitated, then agreed. We met at a small place near the old office, neutral ground. He looked tired, older somehow. He told me the fallout inside the company had been messy. Trust had fractured. Departments blamed each other. Karen had taken a leave of absence. The compliance officer had been reassigned. People whispered about who else might have known, who might have looked the other way. Marcus said something that stayed with me. He said, "Watching what happened to you made a lot of us realize how fast the company was willing to sacrifice someone to protect itself." He apologized for not speaking up sooner. I accepted it, not because it erased anything, but because holding on to anger felt like carrying a weight I didn't need anymore. When we parted, I felt lighter than I had in months. Around that time, I was asked to speak at a small industry workshop about process transparency. The invitation came through a colleague at my new firm who knew, vaguely, what I'd been through. I debated declining. Standing in front of people, owning that story, felt exposing. But something in me wanted to reclaim it, to tell it on my terms. So I said yes. On the day of the workshop, my hand shook as I adjusted the microphone. I didn't dramatize anything. I spoke plainly about systems, about checks and balances, about how pressure for quick answers can lead to catastrophic mistakes. I didn't name names. I didn't seek sympathy. I just told the truth. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her brother had been fired under similar circumstances and never recovered. She thanked me for saying what so many couldn't. In that moment, I understood that my experience, as painful as it was, had value beyond me. At home, Maya was growing, changing in ways that made time feel slippery. One night, while we were doing homework at the kitchen table, she asked why people had believed I'd done something wrong when I hadn't. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I told her that sometimes adults make decisions based on fear instead of fairness, that it's easier to blame one person than to slow down and look closely. She nodded, serious, then said, "That's not very brave." I smiled because she was right. Lena and I talked more openly about the strain we'd been under, about how close we'd come to missing mortgage payments, about the nights she'd cried quietly so Maya wouldn't hear. We didn't blame each other, we acknowledged it. There's a difference. Naming the damage didn't weaken us, it stitched us back together. Every so often, news about Eric surfaced, a court date, a plea agreement. I didn't follow it closely. His story was no longer mine to carry. I wished him accountability, not ruin. I believed, still, that people are more than their worst choices, even when those choices devastate others. What surprised me most was how my definition of success shifted. Before, it had been about stability, recognition, being seen as reliable. Now it was about alignment, about working somewhere that matched my values, about coming home with enough energy to be present, about teaching my daughter that truth matters even when it's inconvenient. The experience left scars, but it also sharpened my sense of what I would and wouldn't tolerate. Silence in the face of injustice, processes designed to protect power instead of people. I learned to ask harder questions, to document everything, to trust my instincts when something felt off. If there's a lesson here, it's not that the system always works. It doesn't. It's that your voice matters, even when it shakes, especially then, because speaking up doesn't just clear your name. Sometimes it clears a path for others to walk a little safer after you. As life settled into a new rhythm, I started noticing the quieter ways the past still reached for me. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. A tightening in my chest when an email from management popped up, a flash of defensiveness when someone asked a routine question about my work. I realized that being falsely accused hadn't just threatened my livelihood, it had rewired how I moved through the world. Trust, once given freely, now came with conditions. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started therapy. Not because I felt broken, but because I didn't want to become hardened. The therapist listened without interrupting as I laid out the story, start to finish. When I finished, she said something simple that stayed with me. She said, "You weren't just punished for something you didn't do, you were denied the dignity of being believed." That was it. That was the wound I'd been circling without naming. At work, I slowly allowed myself to exhale. My new manager, Claire, noticed my attention to detail and my habit of documenting every decision. Instead of criticizing it, she encouraged it. She said it made the team stronger. That validation, small as it was, felt like a balm. I began mentoring a junior analyst, teaching him not just the mechanics of the job, but the importance of ethics. I didn't frame it as fear. I framed it as responsibility. One afternoon, I received a LinkedIn message from someone I didn't recognize. She said she'd been in the compliance department at my old company and had since left. She apologized for not pushing harder when doubts arose during the investigation. She admitted there had been pressure from above to resolve the issue quickly. Reading her words, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Anger that speed had mattered more than truth, relief that my instincts had been right. I replied, kindly but briefly, closure doesn't always require conversation. Financially, we were recovering, slowly. The settlement helped us catch up, but it didn't restore what had been lost. We rebuilt our savings bit by bit. Lena and I celebrated small wins, a paid-off credit card, a modest family trip. Ordinary moments took on a sweetness I hadn't appreciated before. Crisis has a way of clarifying what actually sustains you. One night, Lena asked if I ever wished I'd fought harder sooner, if I'd gotten a lawyer immediately, if I'd gone public. I thought about it, about the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty. I told her I wished the system had made it easier to be heard, but I didn't regret how I'd survived. Survival isn't always strategic. Sometimes it's just stubborn. Maya brought home a school assignment about integrity. She asked me to help her with it. As we talked, I realized how careful I was being, trying not to load her with cynicism. I told her, doing the right thing doesn't guarantee an easy outcome, but it guarantees you can live with yourself. She wrote that down, tongue between her teeth, serious and focused. I felt a quiet pride I hadn't felt in a long time. Occasionally, I'd hear from former coworkers who'd left the company. They told me morale had never fully recovered, that policies had changed, but trust hadn't. I didn't feel vindicated by that, just sad. Organizations, like people, don't heal by pretending nothing happened. I also noticed something else. When people shared their own stories of being wrongly blamed or misunderstood, I listened differently. I didn't rush to fix or judge. I believed them. There's power in that. Being believed is a kind of medicine. The past year taught me that reputation is fragile, but character is durable. It bends, it gets tested, but if you hold on to it long enough, it can outlast lies. I no longer measured my worth by titles or tenure. I measured it by alignment, by honesty, by the quiet knowledge that I'd faced something unjust and hadn't become unjust in return. I don't know if I'll ever stop flinching at sudden meetings or unexpected emails. Maybe that's just part of the cost. But I also know this: I am not defined by the worst accusation made against me. I am defined by how I stood when the ground gave way. And standing, I've learned, is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. By the time a full year had passed since the day I was walked out of that building with a cardboard box in my hands, the memory no longer hit me like a blow. It came more like a pressure change, noticeable, uncomfortable, but survivable. Anniversaries have a strange power. They don't reopen wounds so much as remind you where the scars are and what they cost. I marked that year quietly. No speeches, no social media posts, just a long walk after dinner, the cold air steadying my thoughts. I realized that the anger I'd once carried like fuel had mostly burned off. What remained was something steadier: resolve, the determination to never again confuse silence with safety. At work, I was given more responsibility. Claire asked me to lead a small team on a sensitive internal review project. Old instincts flared: reviews, investigations. I told her honestly that the assignment stirred things up for me. She didn't dismiss it or try to persuade me with corporate optimism. She said, "Then let's do it the right way, slowly, transparently, together." That one sentence showed me how different leadership could be when it was rooted in respect instead of fear. The project went well. We documented everything. We asked uncomfortable questions. We gave people time to respond. When issues surfaced, they were addressed without scapegoats. When it concluded, Claire thanked me publicly for my integrity. The word landed differently this time. It didn't feel like a consolation prize. It felt earned. Outside of work, something unexpected happened. I started getting messages from people who'd heard my workshop talk or been referred by someone who had. They weren't looking for legal advice. They were looking for reassurance. They wanted to know how to survive being blamed for something they didn't do. I never claimed to have answers. I just listened. I told them what helped me. Document everything, protect your mental health, and don't let anyone rush you into accepting a version of events that isn't true. One man told me he was considering confessing to something he hadn't done just to make the pressure stop. Hearing that made my chest tighten. I told him gently but firmly that the pressure would stop eventually, but the lie would follow him forever. He thanked me. I don't know what he decided. I hope he chose himself. Lena noticed the shift in me before I did. She said I seemed steadier, more present, less haunted. We talked about the future with less caution, not recklessly, but with a sense that we were allowed to plan again. We talked about saving for Maya's education, about taking a real vacation, about the small house improvements we'd postponed when money was tight. Normal conversations reclaimed. One evening, while sorting through old files on my computer, I found the folder I'd created during the worst months. Notes, dates, screenshots, everything I'd used to hold on to reality when it felt like it was slipping. I hovered over the delete key, then stopped. I realized that folder wasn't a reminder of pain anymore. It was proof of endurance. I backed it up and stored it away, not as a weapon, but as a record. Around that time, I ran into Karen at a grocery store. We stood awkwardly near the produce section, both unsure how to begin. She looked tired, but calmer than I remembered. She apologized again, this time without corporate language. She said she'd learned things she wished she'd known earlier, that she trusted the process without questioning who it served. I told her I appreciated the apology. I didn't absolve her. I didn't accuse her. I let it sit where it was. Sometimes accountability doesn't require confrontation, just acknowledgement. Walking away from that conversation, I felt something loosen. Not forgiveness exactly, but release. Carrying resentment is heavy, and I'd carried enough. Maya, now older, more observant, asked me one night if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it before answering. I told her happiness wasn't a constant state. It was a series of moments you learned to recognize and protect. She nodded like she understood more than I expected. Looking back, I see how easily my story could have ended differently, how a rushed investigation, a convenient lie, could have permanently rewritten my life. The fact that it didn't isn't proof that the system worked. It's proof that persistence matters, that refusing to internalize a false story can be an act of quiet rebellion. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this. Never underestimate how much damage a careless accusation can do, and never underestimate how much strength it takes to wait for the truth without surrendering to bitterness. The waiting is the hardest part. It tests you in places no one else sees. And yet, here I was, still standing, still believed, still capable of building something honest from the ruins of something false. As the second year after everything began to unfold, I noticed that people were no longer reacting to my story with shock. Instead, they reacted with recognition. Almost everyone had a version of it. Being blamed unfairly, misunderstood, quietly pushed aside so something uncomfortable could be resolved quickly. My experience stopped feeling rare and started feeling disturbingly common. That realization changed how I carried it. This wasn't just something that happened to me, it was something that could happen to anyone. I was invited to speak again, this time at a larger conference. The audience was full of managers, auditors, and compliance professionals, people who made decisions that shaped other people's lives. Standing at that podium, I felt the weight of responsibility more than nerves. I told them I wasn't there to accuse or dramatize. I was there to remind them that behind every case file was a human being with a family, a history, and a future that could be damaged beyond repair by haste. I told them that process without empathy becomes cruelty, even when it's unintentional. Afterward, a senior executive approached me. He said my talk had unsettled him in a good way. He admitted that he'd once signed off on a termination he hadn't fully reviewed because the evidence seemed clean. He said he'd think differently now. I didn't know if his words would change anything, but I knew they mattered. Sometimes change starts as discomfort. At home, life felt fuller, not louder or grander, just fuller. Lena laughed more easily. Maya grew into herself, curious and outspoken. One afternoon, she came home upset because a classmate had been blamed for something she didn't do. Maya told the teacher what she'd seen, even though it made her nervous. When she told me the story, I felt something in my chest settle. The lesson had traveled further than I realized. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when an unexpected email would make my stomach drop, when I'd reread a message to make sure nothing could be misinterpreted. Trauma doesn't vanish just because the truth wins. It softens slowly, like stone worn down by water. I learned to be patient with myself in that process. One evening, while cleaning out the garage, I found the old cardboard box I'd brought home on my last day at Halstead & Row. It was flattened, tucked behind a shelf, forgotten. I unfolded it and ran my hands along the creases. For a moment, I was back in the elevator, heart racing, dignity packed beside a coffee mug. Then I folded the box back up and recycled it. A small act, but a meaningful one. I didn't need to keep that symbol anymore. I also stopped checking for updates about Eric. His story had reached its conclusion in the courts. Mine had moved on. Holding on to his name felt like holding on to a door that no longer led anywhere. Letting go wasn't forgiveness, it was self-preservation. People sometimes ask me if I'd do anything differently, if I'd protect myself more aggressively, if I'd trust less. I tell them I'd do one thing differently. I'd speak sooner. Not louder, but sooner. Silence didn't protect me. Documentation did. Community did. Persistence did. Those are lessons I carry now, not as armor, but as tools. The greatest shift, though, happened internally. I stopped needing everyone to understand what I'd been through. Validation is powerful, but it can become a dependency if you let it. I knew the truth. The people who mattered knew it. That was enough. One night, Lena and I sat on the porch after Maya had gone to bed. The air was warm, quiet. She asked me if I ever missed my old life. I thought about it honestly. I missed the simplicity, the assumption that good work guaranteed safety. But I didn't miss the blindness. I didn't miss believing that institutions always acted in good faith. Losing that illusion hurt, but it also sharpened me. I told her that what we had now felt more real, hard-earned, grounded. She reached for my hand and squeezed it. We sat there for a long time, not talking, just present. Peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in quietly when you're not looking. As I look back now, I see that being falsely accused didn't just test my integrity, it revealed it. It stripped away what was superficial and left me with what was essential. The truth didn't rush to save me, but it arrived all the same, and when it did, I was still standing. There is one last chapter to this story, one final moment that brought everything full circle and forced a choice I never expected to face. The final chapter of this story didn't arrive with drama or headlines. It arrived quietly, the way most defining moments do, disguised as a simple request. An email landed in my inbox from a law firm representing Halstead & Row. At first, my chest tightened out of habit, old reflex, but as I read, the tension shifted into something else entirely. They were facing a civil suit from a former client who'd uncovered broader compliance failures connected to the same rushed investigation that had ended my employment. The firm wanted to know if I would be willing to provide a statement about my experience, not as an accuser, as a witness. I stared at the screen for a long time. I had no obligation. My settlement didn't require cooperation. I had rebuilt my life. This could reopen doors I'd worked hard to close. I thought about the cardboard box, now recycled. I thought about the folder of notes safely stored away. I thought about Maya standing up for her classmate. And I realized this wasn't about the company anymore. It was about whether I would use what I'd learned when it mattered again. I agreed with conditions: transparency, accuracy, no embellishment, no spin, just the truth as I'd lived it. The deposition took place in a plain office building on a quiet street. I sat across from attorneys who asked careful questions. I answered carefully too. I described the rush to judgment, the refusal to slow down, the absence of meaningful verification. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't assign motives. I simply laid out what happened and how it had impacted my life. As I spoke, I felt something settle deep inside me. This wasn't reopening a wound. This was sealing it. Afterward, one of the attorneys thanked me. He said cases like this often hinge on whether someone is willing to speak plainly without vengeance. I nodded. Vengeance had tempted me once. It had burned hot and fast, then faded. What remained was clarity. Weeks later, I learned the company had agreed to significant reforms as part of the settlement: independent audits, clearer escalation paths, mandatory review periods before termination decisions. It wasn't redemption, but it was responsibility. Knowing that my experience might help someone else from going through what I had made the entire ordeal feel less senseless. The final moment that brought everything full circle came unexpectedly. I received a letter, handwritten, from Eric. It had been forwarded through his attorney. I debated whether to open it. Curiosity won. Inside, his words were clumsy but sincere. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't justify himself. He acknowledged the harm he'd caused and said he was learning, slowly, what accountability meant. He wrote that seeing the consequences of his actions had changed how he understood himself. I folded the letter and set it aside. I didn't respond, not out of anger, but because closure doesn't always require dialogue. Sometimes it's enough to know the truth reached the person who tried to bury it. That night, I sat with Lena at the kitchen table, the same place where months earlier we'd stared at bills and uncertainty. I told her about the deposition, the reforms, the letter. She listened, then said something simple. She said, "You chose integrity every time it cost you something." I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Integrity isn't tested when it's rewarded, it's tested when it's expensive. Maya, older now, more aware of the world's sharp edges, asked me once if I was glad everything happened. The question surprised me. I told her I wasn't glad for the pain, but I was grateful for what it revealed, about systems, about people, about myself. I told her that life doesn't always protect the innocent quickly, but it does respond to persistence, to truth told calmly and clearly. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, I want you to hear this clearly. Being falsely accused can make you doubt your own reality. It can shrink your world and make you feel like speaking is dangerous. But your story matters. Document it, protect it, share it with people who will listen without judgment. Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits for you to stop apologizing for it. Today, my life is quieter, stronger. I work with people who value transparency. I come home to a family that knows what resilience looks like up close. I no longer measure safety by how comfortable things feel, but how honest they are. I was fired for a crime I didn't commit. I lost time, money, and certainty, but I didn't lose myself. And when the real culprit confessed, it didn't give me back what was taken. It gave me something else: perspective, boundaries, and the unshakable knowledge that truth, even delayed, still has the power to set things right. That is the ending. Not perfect, but real.